All right, Kimberly Benoit, in your new book, We've All Done It, you're making the argument that we as leaders need to be more reflective about our potential toxic behaviors. So I've got a top
Mhm.
5 list. We used to do top 10 lists, but people have shorter attention spans now. So we've shrunk it down to a top 5 list of potential toxic scenarios. Jodah and I are going to present, these two going back and forth, and we just want to see, have you done any of these? So, number 1, during your annual performance review, your boss asked you why you haven't figured out how to clone yourself so you can be in 3 places at once and collaborate with your clones on the annual Christmas party. Have you done that? Or have you experienced that?
No, not
Okay.
exactly.
Well, let's go to number 2, Jodah. Jodah, you want to take number 2?
Yes. Okay, Kimberly. Number 2.
Yes.
Your boss tells her entire staff that they need to work even more extremely hardcore than Elon Musk's Twitter team, and then goes on a 3-week vacation to Tanzania, where she proceeds to get blitz drunk. Has this happened to you before?
Or something similar?
I have had an instance where we were having an emergency response to something, and suddenly we realized some of our more senior leaders were out, and then found out that they all just so happened to be vacationing in like the same place while we were all working 12 plus hour days. So yes, I've seen that happen.
All right.
That was
Number
awesome.
3.
That was fun trying to explain that. Yes.
Number 3, your boss is praised by the CEO of the business for solving world hunger, but he doesn't even acknowledge that you're the one who invented Soylent Green. Soylent Green is people, folks.
Listen to me, Hatcher. You gotta tell him Soylent Green is people!
Have you ever experienced anything like that at work?
Oh, I think everyone has experienced some leader taking credit for the work that you and your team has done. If that hasn't happened yet, hold on, it will. Yes, that has absolutely happened. Yes.
All right.
But not people.
Not Soylent Green, though.
Not Soylent. You didn't invent Soylent
You didn't
Green,
Soylent
Kimberly?
Green.
Have you ever tried it?
And it's so funny. I wonder how many people actually really get that reference. That's
People.
such a generational reference.
people.
They're actually, if you do a search, there is a product out there now called Soylent Green. It's a protein drink or something like that. I don't.
But the original reference.
Exactly. Yes. It's
So
not
for
made
the
of
kids out
aging.
there, there's a movie called Soylent Green. It's about, the product is actually made out of humans. You kind of like WALL-E, because I think there's a theory like in that WALL-E movie, like the people on that spaceship are actually eating other human
Each other?
beings. Yeah. You didn't know that?
That is a theory? I didn't know that.
That is
No.
dark. Very dark.
Oh,
Yeah.
that is really dark. Kind of
It does.
changes
It
the whole
does.
movie.
It's a much darker movie than you think.
Yeah.
All right, number 4. Speaking
I
of
sure
dark,
hope
number
Disney
4.
doesn't come after us. That's okay. We don't know if that's true, Disney. We're just hypothesizing. Pixar, yeah. Okay, number 4. You never know which boss will greet you when you walk into their office. Is it Dr. Jekyll's cheerful smile or Mr. Hyde's evil eyebrows? They're alive. The eyebrows are alive, and they are malicious. So have you encountered this before?
Oh, yeah. Uh-huh.
I used to have a boss that I was pretty much convinced her eyebrows were alive, and they would speak to me during meetings.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I think in any situation you can have, and what I'm referencing too is like I live in an area that's prone to like a lot of natural disasters, and so when you think about, and it's truly like with COVID and stuff, you never knew sometimes like if people hadn't slept the night before, you probably end up talking to somebody very different.
Oh yeah, yeah, 100%.
But if you're talking about just somebody who generally has like personality instability on a regular, yeah, I think everybody's probably encountered one or two of those. I mean, I have over 20 years of work experience, so I'm pretty sure, yes, there's a couple of faces that might come to mind.
All right, so number 5, and this is the last one. You receive a directive that it's imperative for you to return to the office right away, but still do all of your meetings on Zoom, including your boss's mandatory team building karaoke sessions. Have you experienced that, Kimberly?
Fortunately, no, because I now work for myself, so I'm not forced to go back into an office. But I do know many people that absolutely applies to, because they think it's hysterical that they're sitting in a cube on Zoom meetings next to other people in their cubes. Like, it is the most absurd thing I've ever heard of in my entire
I sometimes
life.
am at work thinking that myself. I'm like, came all the way to work and all my meetings are on Zoom.
I'm really still like trying to figure out what are people like, what are some of these leadership thinking? Like, there's no way you're going to maintain the same level of productivity. And also, maybe they just want to, like, they're mad because they're stuck in a lease they can't get out of. And so we're going to pay, it's sunk cost. So we're going to make you come in anyway. I have no idea. But yes, making people come in to do that is, I personally grateful, not my problem, but it is for a lot of people.
For sure.
Definitely a problem.
It is a problem. We're here to talk about problems, specifically toxic workplace problems, here on the Sense and Signal podcast. And today we're here with Kimberly Benoit, a leadership and workplace toxicity expert who coaches, consults, and speaks for organizations needing fresh strategies to keep great leaders, unite teams, and combat toxicity. As the best-selling author of the book, We Have All Done It, and host of the podcast of the same name, Kimberly is on a compassionate, sometimes humorous, mission to help us get real about the role we each play in creating toxic workplaces, so we can all become better, more confident leaders, teams, and organizations in the process. So I want to start off by saying I am not toxic. And why would you accuse me of being toxic with your book, Kimberly?
Oh, we are all dysfunctional at some point. And the way I like to say it is, we are all the fun and dysfunction at some point in time. And it's okay to say that. Like, and if you can't say that, then we actually know what your dysfunction is. Because everybody does it. Like, are you perfect every day?
Dan thinks so. We had a very deep conversation, and Dan thinks he's perfect every day. Yes.
So we know what his blind spot is.
Very apparent. Yeah, would that be narcissism? That'd be narcissism, right? Or would that be sociopath? I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure.
A little bit of all of it. But I mean, like, that's the joke I make, is for anybody who says, oh no, I am always right, I know what I'm doing. And I'm like, well, we clearly know what your blind spot is, because everyone screws up at some point in time. And that's what the point of it is. The biggest issue for me is, I feel like, particularly coming out of corporate, is it's gotten harder to be able to say I've screwed up. And so I just really wanted to have a conversation as a leader who was happy to raise my hand and say I've screwed up on more occasions than I care to count, but I'm happy to talk about it if it makes it more comfortable for other people to say, oh.
So are you saying apologizing for your mistakes is okay?
Not only is it okay, I think it's imperative in our work environment now. If you're not able to own up to your own stuff, how do you expect your team members to own up to their stuff? It's the whole lead by example. If you are going to completely get really defensive and say, nope, I am perfect, your team is going to do the exact same thing. So it ends up kind of becoming this, I hate to say it, toxic spiral where nothing works. So yeah, exactly. Like,
so I want to. So your book is fantastic. I enjoyed reading it quite a bit. And the next question I see here says, "What kinds of mirrors are out there that you can help us be more reflective?" And I really think your book is one of those mirrors. I really appreciated the layout. I like the questions that you kind of dug into, and how you sort of approached it. It's a fun read. It's an easy read, and it's one that is sort of like I said, a nice mirror. How did you come up with the idea of writing a book like this?
So it's so funny because, and I actually have it in the book, but I was having cocktails with a friend of mine and we were having just a straight up bitch fest. And we were talking about leaders, other leaders, not ourselves, about like how we like them as people, but we just wouldn't want to work
I hear
for
that
them,
a lot.
for various reasons.
That is a common conversation. I've heard it multiple times.
Well, and so, I mean, maybe a glass of wine or so later, I had this like lightning bolt moment and I thought, God, I wonder how many of my former employees would see my face or having this conversation, but it's about me. And that's kind of where it started, was like, oh, and of course, immediately I could think of at least one or two people who don't like, who I've worked with. I know how they felt about me. It was never hidden. And I thought, well, clearly we've got a few to start with. And so what ended up happening is I started having more conversations with people and asking the same question, like, have you ever had a toxic leader, like somebody who you just really hated? And of course, people would say, how much time do you have? I think we need cocktails. And they would tell stories upon stories. And then when I would ask that second question of, well, how many people see your face, do you think? If I asked them that question. And then it was like the weird moment of like, oh, well, a few. And so the thought about that became is there some validity to it? Like, is there some reason why that didn't work? Is there a reason why they see my face? Did I do stuff that maybe contributed to why they didn't have a great experience with me as a leader? And that's really where it started was, it's so easy to point the finger at somebody else and say they are the problem, when the reality is it's probably a two-way street. And so until you
I just point at my employees.
And what is your turnover like? Can I
stick around. I got them locked in.
You must pay them very, very well. But that became the thing, was like, so if I wanted to be the leader I aspired to be, do I need to ask myself some questions first before I just say, no, they just, it's all them. And so it just kind of went down that path of part of like, how do I get better as a leader and what do I want to do differently?
I think, a great response there. And I find that we're having a lot of conversations around this space in one form or another. And, there's this one dividing line that Dan and I have found some research on around what's called we're living in what's called a post-industrial. Is that what it's called? Post-industrial post-industrial organizations. That we're in that phase. We're in this post-industrial, and it's deemed one of its big components is self-reflection. It's like looking back, and I'm wondering if
sense making, self-reflection as part of the sense making process,
right? And I'm wondering if bosses always knew that they were part of the problem, but at one point in time it just didn't matter. It's like, I'm the boss.
Oh yeah. Oh, and so I think there's also a generational thing too, because you look at some older generations, there was no need to be touchy-feely. You got paid you got paid money to come in and do a job. And there was no engagement strategies. There was no there's no warm and fuzzies. It was like, show up, do what you got to do. But I think where we're moving societally, our workers now expect something very different.
For sure.
And they are not interested in being told where they are deficient without there being some ownership on the leader's part of like, what are you bringing to the table? And how are you helping me get better? How are you helping me do my job? It's not a one-way street anymore. So if leaders don't start to make the adjustment and say, okay, this is ratcheting up. Let me step back for a second and think, okay, hold on, pump the brakes. What are you doing? Like, what are you feeling right now? And how is that showing up? And what does that look like to your team member? I think it's going to become harder to be a successful leader because people will just leave. I mean, the data is there. During the Great Resignation, that was like the number one indicator why people left their roles. It wasn't salary. It was toxicity in the workplace. It was tolerating.
People quit they don't quit their jobs. They quit their bosses, right?
Well, or they quit the culture. You can quit the culture too, because, I have seen leaders who are trying to do the right things, but the culture of the larger team or the larger organization isn't supportive of like what's actually trying to happen. So I think it's that kind of thing. I think workers are expecting more than what they have expected in the past. And I think that's where a lot of the idea of how do you, what are you, as I say, what BS or bullshit are you bringing to the table? You can't just look at your employee and say, do more. You just can't. They're not going to stay around. They're going to peace out on you.
So, being like a perfect supervisor without any toxicity, I want to really support the people below me, the leaders below me. So I want them to be more reflective about their potential toxicity. Are there techniques that you recommend for encouraging that that
to empower his narcissism, to give him more teeth?
You're so hysterical. Well, so again, coming from a leadership perspective, it's always asking the same things is, what do you think is going well here? What do you think is not going well? What are other things you could be trying in this moment? And so I will tell you one of the things that I have found really interesting is, so I do a lot of executive and leadership coaching, and I work with a lot of people. And I've had several clients actually come to me and say, I'm about to quit. I hate this place. I hate these people. And through a lot of work around helping them, and just understanding the scenario and how they are showing up, what option are you choosing? Of the options you have in front of you, why did you choose that course of action? What would have potentially been the outcome if you chose any other course of action? And helping them see that sometimes the position they take or the choice that they made actually ratcheted the chaos up. Because again, they're in such an emotional, if you know the Brene Brown reference, they were armored up hard and they were ready for battle. And so they chose the option that made advance their position versus saying, okay, what are we doing as a team to kind of resolve it as a bigger picture? So I think it's really, I ask people a lot of times if there's a lot of craziness, let's look at all your options and understand what would that mean if you did something else? What would that look like? And just helping them think through, does it weaken your position if you're open to somebody else? Because sometimes we get so defensive, we want to win. I'm saying that in quotations. Right. We want to win. So it becomes about winning the argument versus saying, what's the right thing to do here, even if it's not my position that's the one that's the strongest or the one that's picked. So I think it's just asking the good questions of if you're hitting resistance, let's really dig in. What is that about? So where do you think that's coming from? And then know if you're digging in and kind of laying it out a little bit, then really look at your options of what's your next best step. Because if you keep doing the same thing you're doing, you're going to get the same stuff, which is not what you're trying to accomplish. Because as leaders, that's what we're expected to do. We're expected to be the adult in the room. We're expected to get it done. So how do you make the next best step with all the information and awareness that you now have?
Now a word from one of our video sponsors, toxicInterimManagers.com. Do you need a toxic manager to come in and clear out your office? Don't wait a second more. Contact toxicInterimManagers.com today. They have a whole menu of folks you can hire, from the old battle axe who'll come in and fire your entire C-suite to the backdoor conspirator who'll spread lies and innuendo throughout your whole organization through whisper campaigns, to old Uncle Favoritism who'll make all of your underperforming employees feel like top-notch stars and all of your high-performing employees feel like complete losers. Your retention rates will plummet and your vacancy rates skyrocket. So don't wait. The recession is right around the corner. Email toxicInterimManagers@AOL.com and mention that the Sense and Signal podcast sent you. And they'll send you a free tote bag, because after you hire one of their managers, you might just be packing up your office and heading out the door too. Do not wait a minute more.
No, I'll say that the place that I am currently working at is probably one of the how do I say? I don't want to maybe emotion. Well, let's say I'm emotionally safest companies I've ever worked at. I'm not going to mention the company, but I mean, you can look it up and find it out. But it's given me a really interesting environment, and because I've worked at quite the opposite, and the environment can definitely get you stoked to what you call armor up.
Yeah.
It can, the environment can actually start stoking that fire. And you're like, oh my gosh, this is an environment I'm going to have to protect myself. And so kind of leaning a little more in kind of like Dan's question, and this is really for both of you. I mean, like how do you prevent, I mean, it's so easy to be on guard all of a sudden, especially if you are in a toxic environment. And I love us for in a moment to really kind of start to define a little bit about what a toxic environment looks like. But sticking with that notion of like, what are the techniques or methods to be able to prevent yourself from getting rolled into that, being, not succumbing to the world around, not becoming a mirror of what you think is being projected, but being bigger than that, I think, which was something you were just mentioning. Are there ways to kind of take self-repose? I mean, it's tough, right? I mean, how does one do that?
Well, I want to ask the person who's perfect at it first.
I will answer this question perfectly.
I'm
So
interested
to
in
me,
your perfect reflection.
Every time I look in the mirror, it kind of cracks. So there's limits to my perfection. So one thing, and what Jodah's question made me think about was environments, and what kind of environment does a person feel despair in? And you feel despair when two things are happening in the environment to me. One is that you don't feel like you have the skills and the ability to tackle the task at hand. You're not equipped. And then on top of that, you don't feel like the environment around you is supporting you. And so and I think that's where leadership comes into play, right? Like a good leader is going to coach people and make sure that they're developing the skills so that the tasks they have at hand for their job they can do. And you're going to cultivate a environment where they feel supported, where they feel like they have the resources they need to do the work they need to do, where they have the information they need, the money even, and all those things. So I think for me is a combination of making sure people have the self-efficacy to do the work and also the environment supporting them. And then toxicity comes in various ways that sabotage those two things.
Yeah. I think that, so I'm going to answer it very behaviorally, because I think that's one of the things, and because this is part of what I think when I've worked with people before. So when I'm hearing you, I can quickly envision a situation where you have people in a room and you're literally watching them puff up like roosters. Like they're puffing up, they're getting red in the face, like, because it's, I'm talking about. People are they're armored up, everybody's entrenched. They're dug in wherever they are. And so usually in those moments when I'm working with someone who finds themselves in that position, and I'll tell you, this is stuff that I've had to do and I've had to work on a lot because I have a hot temper. I'm a, Southern Cajun girl.
You?
Oh, it doesn't come out often, but boy, when it does, you really wish it didn't. And so, but I've had to work.
It's a basket personality. I gotcha. Yeah.
Oh, it's a bad mix. So, but it's the thing of when you find yourself getting into that position, it's the first thing is, how do you first become aware that you are going tit for tat? Do you even know you're doing it? So how do you catch yourself? And in those moments, before you open your mouth, very simply, before you respond to a statement, take at least one good solid inhale in, exhale out. So that way, you're starting to try to regulate your system, and you're giving your brain a hot second to not just spit out whatever it is you're just gunning to say, but also give yourself a moment of pause to maybe think that's not the right thing to say next. It may feel good in the moment, but is that actually helping or hurting your situation or the situation in general?
I say the same thing with email, right? I mean, I had an email exchange. who interacts with human beings anymore? All my correspondence is on email. I haven't seen a human being in 4 years.
Well, and same thing with text messages. Same thing. Different kinds of written communication. You don't understand tone. And so you're going to read that email and interpret that email through whatever lens you're feeling in that moment. So if you feel like that person's being snarky, maybe they weren't. Maybe they were.
Oh, I know the person who sent me an email last week was being snarky. I had to walk up to McDonald's and get a Big Mac.
Well, that's a coping mechanism.
Also, a recipe to gain some weight while you're trying to cope. So, yeah.
Let's not have a heart attack in the middle of coping.
Took a walk. I walked there. I
know that's enough for McDonald's, but okay.
I'm lying. I didn't walk there.
You had it delivered. What are you talking? Uber.
I know.
You know, I love that. Yeah, that I think that's being conscious of the moment, and that's obviously a muscle that one has to work out, right?
Well, and sometimes you need feedback on it too. So, I mean, this is not these are very practical things that sound really basic, but do you have a friend? Like, I would ask you, do you have a friend in the meeting? Like, do you have a peer that you actually like and likes you? Okay, y'all need to have a code. So when you start to completely go, like, they see it. You know when that person is losing touch with the moment. That's a nice way to say it. They're losing touch. Nice. What is a signal they can give you that, hey, you need to rear it back a little bit, like pull those reins a hot second and take a breath. And if it's really getting to the point where it's not productive and you really are feeding that fire in a way that you wouldn't in a different moment, like, right? Because to me, the idea is you've hit a toxic point is when you look back and say, God, I really wish I didn't do that. Like, that's not who I wanted to be in that moment. I showed up as the worst version of myself. And yep, they have every right to say I'm Satan, because that's exactly what I was in that moment. Like, that's the moment you want to try to dial it down. So how do you start to create mechanisms for yourself? And I mean, you have to put them in, because you're not going to figure it out all by yourself.
Jodah and I have that. I just tell him to zip it.
It's very direct. It's called open candor, and you just zip it.
You have a feedback-friendly environment.
You know, and it's funny with that part. Sometimes, you know, it's interesting our behavior, because you can kind of know when you're feeling it, when internally, you know, and sometimes it might not even manifest externally to the degree that you're horrified with. But you know, internally, you're reacting to the experience in the wrong way that you just described. And even if the people externally didn't necessarily notice it, when you notice it too, you're like, damn, I still walked away from that meeting or that situation feeling crappy. Like I was responding internally to everything they were saying just in such the worst way. And so then it kind of makes me shut up. Maybe I might not be saying I might at the opposite, right? I'm not saying enough because I'm actually completely just sort of shutting down internally. So I think it can go both directions, right? There's this, it can make you clam up to some degree if, you know that anything that's going to come out of your mouth is just not going to be the right thing. And then all of a sudden they get this long-winded email from me 3 days later, and it's out of sight, out of mind for them. And they're like, what the hell is he talking about? I'm like, well, I had a moment to actually think about whatever he said. You know, it's like, damn, I missed my moment. So.
Well, I mean, so this goes back to the whole idea of, different behaviors show up differently in people, right? So, you know, for you, when somebody, like, one person could set you off where you become like the overwhelming talker and are like, no, I'm going to drown you out. And you could walk into another meeting later in the afternoon with a different personality and have that response of like, oh no. And you just clam up and get really quiet. And I think that's where this becomes more challenging, because as humans, we're not widgets. We're not going to respond exactly the same way all the time to the same things. The other aspects of whatever's happening in that scenario are going to feed how you show up and what buttons get pushed and in what way those are going to kind of manifest themselves in the moment. So, and I think those are it's when you stop and you think, oh crap, like, I can't believe I did that. That's when you have to start asking the questions of like, what got me there? Like, how did I like go that far? What did they do that, like, and I hate to say it this way, but like, what were the other things that were happening that pushed the buttons in me so far that I became this version of myself that I really didn't like? Because I guarantee you, it's going to be somebody else, right? So it doesn't matter what company you're in or team you're on. If you don't figure that out, it's going to happen again because, there's only so many kinds of personalities in the world and you're going to find yourself in those situations again. So do the work when it shows up because hopefully you can learn for the next time.
Yeah, and I imagine a lot of it has to do with fear too, right? The toxic behavior, even from a leader who's been triggered by something, they're probably their limbic system's fired off, the amygdala's raging, and they're acting out of fear. Do you think there's some truth to that?
I think there's a lot of stimuli about why somebody triggers on things. Like I wrote about it in the book. Like there were so many leaders that I had known who were such solid rock people. And then COVID hit and they couldn't find toilet paper. They're suddenly homeschooling their kids. Their parents are sick with there's all these things happening and they just couldn't process anymore. And so they became kind of different versions of themselves. But I do think what it becomes interesting to me is when people don't want to talk about it, I do think fear is a component of it. They fear other people judging them. They fear other people's opinions of them. I think fear shows up in different ways about why you may do certain things. But I also think fear is a component of why we don't talk about it when we're like, oh, because we don't want to look bad in front of other people. Because sometimes admitting weakness, you don't want to be then deemed weak. Or, hey, here's a kink in the armor. Like they may see it, but the reality is everybody sees it, whether or not you acknowledge it. I actually think it makes you a stronger leader to say, hey, this is what I'm working on, than just to pretend it doesn't exist.
That's true.
Which gets back to that generational thing about vulnerability, right? I think being more vulnerable is something that's embraced probably from Gen X down more. And I think probably with each generation a little bit more than maybe.
Although I did have a Gen Z tell me to muscle up the other day. So I'm not sure if it stopped at Z. I don't know.
Muscle up?
I was like, I went, huh? What? So, hey, you two, we've been talking for about 30 minutes here. And I feel like we've kind of been skirting around this notion that really we're kind of, well, we can talk whatever the heck we want to talk about. I don't care. But this notion of toxicity, the thing I found interesting about your book was I have before reading your book, one thought about what toxicity in the environment was. And it's the experiences I've had. Yeah. And they are typically an environment that backstabbing is promoted or is not looked down upon. There's no support from anybody. Everybody kind of lives in a fear state. The leadership is narcissistic. I just had this one picture of what toxicity looks like. And I found it interesting that you have multiple sorts of areas, I like this notion. I'm gonna look at the title here, where my single people are at. Interesting chapter. And I would have never thought about that. So how, taking all your chapters or maybe not, maybe don't do this. What is toxicity? What can we qualify? What does it look like? What does it do? And what are the parts?
So this is so fascinating. So this is one of the reasons I found really fascinating, and why I don't define it as one big definition and try to create Kim's version of toxicity. When I went out and started asking all these people, have you ever had a toxic leader? I just listened to what they told me. So how did they define toxicity? And the thing that I found most interesting was that sometimes they said things and I was like, well, that's not really toxic to me, but boy, you feel like that's a toxic leader. And it became kind of what you're talking about is everybody in their little world, in their little view of life knows what it feels like for them. And so I think there's what I ultimately landed on is we all know that there are certain things we should not do. Right? That there's some, but what exactly is it? I think comes down to what it feels like for that person and what are the just non-negotiables for that person. So for instance, in that chapter, you have a person who is clearly creating differences in how they assign work based on whether or not the person is in a committed relationship and whether or not they have children. And you'd be surprised at how often that happens, where there's assumptions made. Oh, well, I mean, she doesn't have to worry about kid pickup, and he just got out of college, so he's good. Like he's not having to worry about this, that, and the other, so he can take on that extra project. Well, depending on your perspective, that's really shitty. Like, why am I immediately assumed to not have a life? And so for for those people that I talk to that have experienced those things, that was really like, well, I'm not being considered for promotions because, quote, I don't need the money as much because I don't have a family to support. Whew, that's toxic to them. But that might not be toxic necessarily to the person who got the job or got the promotion. Do you see what I mean? So I think that's why I said it's not so much about a definition, but boy is a feeling. And you know it when you feel it. And because that feeling is what's going to decide whether you stay on that team or not. Whether you stay on that company or not.
Maybe I'm going to be really reductive here, and I'm probably going to use an incomplete word. But it seems to me anything that gets in the way of the abstract notion of the system being a meritocracy could be qualified potentially as a toxic thing. I'm probably pretty reductive there, but it seems like, so the example you just gave, they're not being judged upon their effort or who they are, the work they put in or anything like that. It's other things. I got in the way of the meritocracy of the aspect or another.
Mm-hmm. As well as biases and assumptions.
As well as the biases and assumptions. So it seems to me anything that gets in the way of it being fair, it might be. Is that too reductive? I don't know. You tell me.
No, I think you're right in there. So, but the definition of fair is based on the perspective of the person of who's of who the target is, right? So, because I just had this conversation the other day with somebody where you could have one leader, same person shows up the same way every single day and can have two employees, and one employee say, "This is the best leader I've ever worked for." Amazing. Yep. And you can have the other person say, "This is the worst person I've ever worked for. I would never recommend anybody work for this person." And the leader is the same, showing up in the exact same way for those people. And so perspective absolutely matters, which is what I talk about a lot in the book and that's why the self-awareness becomes important and what your options are become important, because not everybody's going to necessarily see things the same. And so therefore the options are not going to be the same. And quite frankly, when you start considering like race and gender and culture and geography, options are going to be different as well. So, so when you think about what is toxic, it really comes down to perspective, which makes things so much harder.
It's I get it. I get that it's subjective, right? Mm-hmm. Based on an individual's experience with that particular person. But, from my vantage point, one of those people's wrong. And it's probably the person who thinks I'm toxic. And how do I know I'm just not dealing with a toxic employee? Why do I need to go through all this self-reflection and therapy when it might just be that this person in my employ is freaking toxic?
So, okay, very clear. I am not saying that there are not toxic employees. And I am not saying that everybody, if they just do this work, will ultimately find their job completely fulfilling. What I am saying is if you don't, you have to ask the questions to start with. And you may still land on, okay, this employee really just thinks a whole lot of themselves. And at best, they're an average employee. And boy, they think they're above average. And I'm doing my best to try to get them there. And in reflecting, maybe I could have handled some feedback conversations differently, but man, we are just never going to end up in the same place.
Yeah, you're
that's
making
okay.
me think, Kimberly. I might have to reflect.
But you know what I mean? But I'm not saying you have to go through 6 months of therapy to figure this out. But I do think it's fair to say, hey, is there something in how I've managed this relationship that is leading this person to believe land them where they are. Because the truth of it is some people are just not right for where they are. They're not on the right team. They don't have the right mindset, yada, yada, yada. That's going to happen, right? People are still going to get probably fired for reasons that are very valid. But also if you flip it and say, but if you don't do it, that's why I say this as a leader, if you see this trend happening with several people on your team, there's a trend. Mm-hmm. Have you asked yourself about this trend? Is that something maybe we should talk about? Maybe we should think about those kinds of things. So if you find yourself trends repeating, or you keep getting the same feedback from people, that's always my favorite too. We do these in corporate, we do all these engagement surveys. And I know historically, most people kind of dismiss them, right? Because depending on where they come from, the questions seem really vague and you don't get a lot of specificity out of them. So you kind of look at them surface level-ish. But the question would be, if you get some trends that continue to show up, you probably need to do more work here. And it's uncomfortable because you have to admit that maybe you're not doing something well. And again, that goes back to that whole fear component. I think there is a lot of fear that you don't want to be the problem and you don't want to, look stupid in front of your peers and in front of your leadership.
How does one, listening
sense.
to Dan, how does one handle an intentional toxic leader such as Dan? What is the this sort of willful sort of like, or are you willfully ignorant than toxic leader?
I'm a willfully ignorant toxic leader.
And that's a special one to me because again, just saying, that's the one that working in, sorry, Silicon Valley, but you're just full of it. There's so many of these people down there, and they all read the Steve Jobs book, and now they're kind of just a-holes, right? And so, and
you need to tell them start reading other people.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, like
Kimberly
Benoit.
Yeah, I mean, aside from, of course, definitely read this book. Again, it's a great mirror. As a person working in a company who, again, that chapter was terrifying for me. That one where you kind of highlight that kind of leader, where he set up the situation where the boardroom and everybody's just these like, yes, I was in fetal position reading it. And I felt so bad for the girl. I'm not going to give anything. Read the book. It's a great little scenario, but
it's not hard to trigger that.
No, and Dan,
Jodah, though, I should say.
And Dan does it all the time. He knows, and he just pulls that trigger.
I do.
Thanks, Dan.
I know what buttons to push.
What is your advice for to deal with just? I know this is anecdotal, but like, what's your advice on dealing in that particular environment? Like, any thoughts around that kind of leader? Maybe the Elon Musk's. I don't know. We can point out the.
Well, what I would say is first off, as a person, if you do the work and say, okay, I've shown up these ways, and it still ends up in this, is like I would talk to somebody else, like get some outside perspective, because sometimes we get stuck in our own stories. That happens a lot, right? And so get someone who challenges your narrative a little bit, and that's going to help you come up with maybe some ways to approach conversations, challenges, situations that you would not have thought of. Maybe get somebody who's within your industry, but then also get somebody who's completely outside of your industry. Just because there might give you a perspective that you would not have otherwise. So one, don't sit in isolation by yourself. I just wouldn't do that because you're already stuck in your head. You're not going to outthink your own self. So get some outside support, whether it's a coach, a mentor, something. Seek somebody else out so that you can have that really productive conversation with. And then what I would say is if you're trying all the things you can and you still find that nothing is moving the ball and you still have this person who's sitting across and you feel like you're being set up to fail, you have to decide what your tolerance is. Because you cannot change anybody. We all like to think we have some control over people and we can change people, but specifically when you're trying to manage up, you're not changing any leader realistically.
They have to be willing to change. Right?
Real quick, Dan,
I heard you on.
Hold on.
One second, though.
Just go ahead. Sorry. No, you hold.
You hold on. No, you zip it.
Go, but I do.
This is such a productive conversation.
This is how it goes. It devolves real fast.
It does. Yeah. All right. So really quick, I heard you on another podcast, a competing podcast, Kimberly, which you're not allowed to do anymore.
I'll check with you.
Is this causing grief?
Yeah, you have to check with us first. Now, oh man. So in that podcast, you talked about the difference between coaching and mentorship.
Yes.
What do you mean? What's the difference between a coach and a mentor?
So, and I think particularly in the last couple of years, coaching has exploded. And so, but I think it gets really murky because some people call themselves coaches, but actually are mentors. So mentors are people that you view as subject matter experts, and they have skills specifically that you want to learn and emulate. Right? So that's why you usually pick mentors within your company and your business, because there's something about what they do you want to do that thing too, exactly like them. So mentors are really good at giving you specific advice and giving you answers and saying, go do X, Y, Z. So that's a mentor. Coaching is a little bit different because I don't have a vested interest in which option you choose. So as a coach, my role is to help you figure out, based on the situation you are in and the information we have, what is the next best step for you. It may not be my next best step, like it may not be what I would have chosen to do, but it's what's right for the person that I'm working with. So versus a mentor, you typically build a personal relationship with. They can serve as an advocate for you. There tends to be a little more closeness there, but I think coaching is kind of a different thing. Think of it as therapy, but without like the mental health diagnoses. Like there's no clinical component to it, but it's really about like, let's dissect what's happening here. Let's understand the pieces and parts, and let's figure out what's the right thing for you. Versus a mentor would say, oh, well, in this situation, here's what I would do. The truth is, it's not important what I would do. This isn't my life. It's your life. So what's the right thing for you based on who you are and your circumstances? So those are kind of the differences. In coaching, you don't give answers usually. It's more about helping you. It's helping that person come up with what is the right thing you want to try next. Then let's talk about it. What worked? What didn't work? Okay, how do we tweak that for you so that you get the outcome you're trying to seek? So again, it's not so much about like, what do I think you should do? It's more about, well, what do you think you should do? You have the right answer. You know what's the best thing for you. I'm just helping you kind of break it down a little bit, challenge that narrative that's in your head, because sometimes we're not our own best story. Like we're not our own best narrator. Because again, we want to be the hero in our own story. Right? Mm-hmm. And sometimes we're not the hero in our story. Sometimes we need to have somebody challenge that.
I will say, so
how do you, ask you a question, Kimberly and Dan, listen, what's the difference between a mentor and overly critical? What's that difference? Dan, listen. No, so can I talk now, boss man? So anyway, thank you.
You have my permission.
Going back to real quick, mine is really anecdotal. So I just remember when I was working for a startup, and I had that kind of boss, and he was that kind of person that was flawed. We'll call him flawed as a person, right? I would say, and he was regularly throwing me under the bus. And I had those mentors. I'm still friends with a couple of them, and they were on my side, and they saw what was happening. In fact, one of them quit because of what was happening, because for him, it was indicative of something bigger besides just about, the relationship I had with this person. Yeah. And we were walking one day, and I said, let's say his name is Dan. So, he's like, Dan, what do I do about this problem? And he gave a real thoughtful, he just kind of, put his hand on his chin, and he goes, Jodah, in the situations when you like, maybe you get in a fight with like a relationship with like your wife, your girlfriend, and you take a moment to pause and think, well, how did I contribute to this? And I said, yeah. He goes, don't do this here. Like I said, there's nothing. This is this person. To your point, it was kind of like, what are you willing to endure? Because this guy's just off the rails, So.
Well, and that's the beautiful part, though, is like, because you were asking those questions, you're like, what can I do differently? And then you may get to the answer is there's nothing you can do. You've done everything you can. But the important point is, are you asking that question in the first place to make sure that you aren't feeding some kind of crazy in the workplace? And that's the thing is, so when you talk about somebody who finds themselves, the best option may be for you, hey, so your next best step is to start figuring out where do you go next? Like this may not be a situation that's healthy or productive for you, and that's okay. And that's an okay option as well, as long as, because I get nervous when people immediately say, well, I'm just going to quit. Okay, well, like, let's slow down, because when you have people that bounce a lot, that's usually one of the things I want to understand is so how is it just that your threshold for tolerance is that low? Or are there things also that maybe are triggers for you that are very, like, what else is happening here? Because you don't want to bounce so hard all the time. And I think sometimes the self-awareness part is very scary. I don't think it's easy for a lot of people. I mean, I'm in my 40s at this point. I'm happy to say that. It's not something that would have been as easy for me in my 20s. And so it's something that comes, I think, it's part of, I think, where we're going culturalized, which we talked about in the beginning. But it still doesn't mean it's easy or that it feels good to be like, oh, I messed that up really badly. So because now that means you have to go and fix it, or at least attempt to fix it if it's fixable. But no, I mean, if you do the work and you still come back and there's nothing you can really do, then you just have to decide what you're willing to tolerate. And when you hit that threshold, are you preparing yourself for what needs to happen next if you're not going to be
it's
in that
interesting.
role?
One of the
next?
tactics I've taken, and I don't know if this is a good tactic or not. One of the things I hate in those situations when it ends, and let's say we go our separate ways or whatever, it just doesn't end well, and then you just got to lick your wounds and move on. When I'm at my most despondent, it's when I feel like I didn't do what you just said. When I feel like I kind of pulled in and gave up, just gave up. And that's the part where I walk away and then I feel is it disempowered? I feel like I robbed myself of something. And what my tactics are in the past years in these circumstances, to lesser and greater degree, because they're always happening to some degree, is when you're at your job, you are balancing risk and reward of behavior at all times, right? To some degree, there's certain value, there's certain things you can win by behaving certain ways, but the risks of failure could be catastrophic. So you don't do that. So, you balance these things out. When I feel like all things are lost, that's when those risk reward changes. I go, okay, well, I'm already in a big risk scenario. There's nothing I can do. So I kind of start swinging for the fences, and I proactively start to do things. But which is interesting, it puts me in a frame of mind where since I'm not defensive, I'm not afraid of the ramifications. So I'm not coming from a defensive perspective, purely offensive. And I don't mean it in a bad way. I mean, like I'm providing it. Not only does it empower me, I feel like I actually have gained results by doing that.
Well, but it comes to the point too, but you've hit the end, right?
Nothing to lose. That's right. Exactly.
But it's the journey you have to go on to get there. Now, granted, I've seen people have nothing to lose and swing for the fences and miss
all the time.
Really, and that happens. But I mean, I think but that comes back to your tolerance, right? So you had nothing to lose. So instead of saying, okay, I'm out, you're like, I'm just going to go for it. I'm going to go for it as big and as bad as I want to. And so it really comes down to that individual choice and the individual options that you're choosing to consider in those moments.
And one last thought that it makes me think of a story in NPR. And I think I told this anecdote in another podcast, but there was a horrific event where in Canada on a bus where a bunch of people, a tour bus was traveling, and this crazy person went crazy and started to cut off somebody's head in the bus. And I don't know if anybody, that was years ago.
That was years ago.
And the bus stopped and people ran out and some people had to stop it, blah, blah, blah. Cops showed up, blah, blah, blah. It was a horrific scene. And that one person died, who he proceeded to try to decapitate. Yeah, he did kill him. He was an older gentleman. And they asked a psychologist, they said, oh my God, this is such a horrific event. Well, how are the people who are on the bus? How are they going to deal with this? What are they going to deal with in the future? And the psychologist said, well, for those who ran off the bus, they will probably be dealing with PTSD for months and years to come. For those who stayed on and tried to stop the event from happening, they will recover much faster. And I found,
Yeah, because they did something.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, and I think that's reflective of work environments too.
Right? That's why I brought it up. It's just like,
right?
People are trying to decapitate each other left and right at my work.
Or what I say, push somebody off the proverbial bridge. Push them off the proverbial
pushing them off a bridge, throwing them under the bus, decapitation.
You have people who are like, when they see it, they're like, I am out. Like, I am not a part of this. I am out of here.
My head's still half on. I can get
And you're laughing because you know it's true. Like, you've got the people who are in it and they're fighting for it, and then you got the people who are like, "Peace out, I am done. Just forget my name. Don't call me. Don't text me. Don't email me. I'm out."
Just kind of disappear. Yeah, exactly.
Oh yeah.
Sometimes it's quitting with a lawsuit.
Oh, and you see, you had no idea that was going to go that direction.
I did not.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
Well, as a leader, I know you're supposed to model other leaders, right? And so I try to model all my leadership off of celebrities. So I'd like to talk about
Oh, wow.
some leaders, some celebrity leaders, like Pete Buttigeg.
Okay.
It's Pete. He's a transportation secretary. He's gotten himself repeatedly into some trouble over his tenure for being absentee. We kind of talked about that, being on vacation a lot or away from the office. At least that's the perception.
Yeah.
And then there was this whole tragedy in Ohio with the train wreck and the toxic gases and the fires. And a reporter, from a more conservative outlet went up to him and tried to interview him on the street. He was very, definitely rude and tried to cut her off and said, this is my space. Go back and look at what I've already said in the press room. Yeah. And then at the end of the sequence, takes out his cell phone and puts it up to her and and starts taking her picture for whatever reason, maybe to get her blocked from other press events or something like that. Who knows? But the optics of it weren't good for him.
Yeah.
So was that a toxic behavior coming out? Were we getting to see something underneath Pete's veneer?
So this is so interesting. Because I think, so we were just talking about quiet quitting, right? And so the thoughts I have about when we think about people who are in the public sphere, and that can apply to political figures, celebrities, as you're talking about. I often think about the fact that we have now become a society that feels that we have the right to have access to people 24/7, regardless of who they are. And because I saw the clip of what you're talking about, and my first thought is I felt like he was trying to be respectful and say, look, I've given 12 interviews today. Can you please go look at that? Like, I'm just trying to have a walk. And I was like, well, if he's given 12 interviews, he's been on, dude's been on guard for a hot second. And my guess is not only this, but if you've been paying attention to anything, he is not having a good work life right now. With all the airplane problems and the near misses on, I can only imagine he's not living the best life. So my first thought is as much as I appreciate our free press and want people wanting to get access, I often also thought people are just people, and at a certain point they're going to crack. The veneer is going to crack. Yeah. So I have these two things. One, he's not a widget, and I think he cracked. Clearly, he cracked. And then I also think, though, is when you're in those positions, that people are going to come after you that way. And so how do you create a structure around yourself to prepare for the inevitable gotcha moments that happen in the world we live in now? Because immediately, when I was looking at that, I was like, that became one of the most clickable things that was out there everywhere. They weren't even talking about the fire anymore in Ohio. They were talking about that interaction. And so I found that interesting, that what she was trying to question him about, nobody was even talking about that. They were talking about their interaction. And so, does that make him a toxic person? No. But what I would say is, I think what I would encourage is, when you get to that stature, you have to create a structure around you, being aware that that's part of your reality now. It's no different than
because you've signed up for it in a sense, right? If you're going into that position and you're
going to be watched.
Considered a contender for the presidency at some point, that you're going to be under extra levels of scrutiny, and people are going to make judgments about how you behave. And
ironically enough, with the fact that he's cruising around a town where is being inundated by toxic fumes, and what you just described seems to fit very easily and perfectly in your chapter. What's that smell? Right. This is a person that you're suggesting that is overworked, underappreciated, and let's be honest, kind of failing at his job right now, and is being scrutinized over it, rightly or not rightly. And so if we take a moment and think about, well, this is also a human, you can kind of explain away why this person, like you were saying, is behaving.
You can see where people snap. And And it's unfortunate because that's the last thing you want to happen, right? Because I talk about that in there. Like, you can have the best intentions for things, but if you're burnt out and you're not thinking very clearly, you're going to burn it all down around you, and because you're going to execute it in the worst way possible. And that's kind of what I feel like I was seeing there, is like, there's a lot of ways he could have handled it differently. And I'm sure he probably thinks back on it and was like, I wish I would have handled that differently. But it's how do you put the guardrails around you to say, okay, I probably shouldn't have taken a walk outside if I really didn't want to be bombarded by paparazzi or news organizations or whatever. They're waiting for you out there. Like, unfortunately, your life has to be a little bit different when you hit a certain stature. I hope I never hit that stature, but I don't aim. My goals in life are not that high.
After this podcast,
everything's changing.
It's going to be an unbelievable change to your life. Let me tell you.
That's because Dan docs everybody.
Yes, I do. I dox everybody. I think, to your point, you have to be media savvy. And I think the most media savvy leader that I try to emulate is Donald Trump. Right now, would you think that would you describe Donald as the Donald as a toxic leader?
What I would say, I think he is a perfect example of how some people view a leader as, like, you have some people, when you say his name, think he is like literally like a religious figure. Like, he is like a saint in some way. And then you can talk to other people who view him as absolute Satan. Yeah. Right. What I would say is he is probably no different than anybody else, is that he is somewhere in the middle. All I know is what I see of him on television and what I read. And so, again, I'm very cautious about saying what I think about that from a toxicity standpoint. I've never worked for him. I've never been in a room with him. But you hear different, you can hear such starkly different narratives depending on who's pushing what viewpoint. I would definitely say, I would encourage him at times to maybe think about his words more, because, I don't always understand what he's trying to communicate. But then people can say the same thing about Joe Biden. Yeah. So,
what was his tweet about confetti? Remember that?
Confetti.
I think he was really trying to say COVID, like a year before it happened.
Who knows? And I don't think we ever will.
He just misspelled it.
But again, the same thing being, for people who think can't do anything wrong, or, he's probably somewhere in the middle. And it's, how do we view people more as people and not as an
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that I agree with you that the narratives of the hyper bipolar nature of our media, which is just off the charts, makes it impossible at times to kind of gauge the reality based upon those narratives. But I do feel like watching that gentleman, that he does send off signals to me that suggest he creates a toxic environment with the people around him. He does resemble to me a character from chapter 6. I mean, or is it? Right. Hasn't he said I'm God? I mean, hasn't he said I'm the greatest? I mean, so he literally has said those words. So
he is the greatest.
Only LeBron James should say that, right? So it's like I think, or Serena Williams. I feel that. I'll tell you what's toxic is talking about him. That becomes toxic for a lot of people so quickly, and it makes it tough. So you have to kind of watch yourself a little bit, because you don't want to be disrespectful to anybody, because he's just so polarizing.
Oh, I hope people actually watch the podcast long enough to get to this section.
This is the ending of our podcast. This is the last episode.
Okay, let's be very clear. I do not want pitchforks outside my house. So, no. I mean, he definitely has a very healthy ego.
Yeah, sure.
And And I
healthy.
Yeah, I think
it's overweight.
It's a very healthy ego. And anybody who feels they are the best at everything, that can be a challenging environment.
I would think
with
so,
which to
right?
operate.
Just that alone, right? Yes, exactly. Just that alone. And you even kind of highlight the notion of then having to work in that shadow, right? Which becomes, by definition, kind of possibly a toxic environment. I can suggest other things, I think, that are indicative that he would be someone I would never want to work for. But I think just that alone, just one of those things, right? You just, or a person who on their presidential run also is selling their steaks. I think there's something there. So I just think, regardless of the media polarization, I feel his behavior suggests certain things about it. But anyways, yeah.
Well, I mean, so it comes down to this. Yes, I don't disagree with anything you're saying, but he's still around. So if he were literally as toxic as we're saying he is, why does he have sticking power? And why does he keep showing up? And why do people keep wanting to work with him? They keep wanting to be around him. So there has to be something there that we haven't.
Well, people wanted to work with Steve Jobs too, right? I mean, there's a difference between being toxic and I think you can be toxically effective, right? Like in the end, if the almighty dollar is what counts, and you're being Jack Welch, right? He's famous for being slashing GE, what they call him, Napalm Welch or something, like, because he just, and today the way he approached things, we would say was just evil, right? But at the time we qualified that because he was effective. He was getting the numbers for the SEC, for the stock market. That was for the metric that they cared about. Office happiness was not one of the metrics. Right? It's not, you don't see the stock market go up because everybody's really happy in the office. We're really, that's not the metric, right? It's dollars.
Yeah.
We weren't doing climate surveys back then? I don't know.
Yeah. So
we just weren't probably talking about them as much.
So I want to talk about another person who liked to sell food before they became president. Jimmy Carter. He sold peanuts, right? He was a peanut farmer.
Yep.
So what was he toxic? Do you think that there was a potential that Jimmy could have been toxic?
I think everybody has the
he's
potential.
Still alive.
Well,
yeah.
Okay, let's.
While we're recording, that is.
Yeah, I was like, man's on his deathbed. So, I mean, I think every person has the ability to be toxic. I don't think anybody is immune from it in any way, shape, or form.
He's such a nice, gentle man.
No, but I mean, just again, like I think everybody has the tendencies. Everybody has blind spots of some kind that can make them, difficult to be around or difficult to want to work for. So it just comes down to, I don't know enough about his leadership to be able to answer that particular question. I mean, I know a little bit about him, but I don't know enough about him.
Well, besides the sinful thoughts that somehow Dan is aware of,
But then again, he was like the fact that he even admitted to that, like he brought in vulnerability before it was a thing.
Yes.
Yeah. He should have waited. He was as a man before his time. He would have been great as Gen Z president.
Well, think about it. He was the first to put solar panels in the White House.
That's right.
That's true.
That's right. Mm-hmm. But he was also he lost his election. People say due to his malaise speech that basically was too truthful for the country. So one can argue that maybe one can be too vulnerable, and maybe too much vulnerability can be toxic.
Oh, yeah. I mean, have you ever worked with somebody who was the oversharer and you knew way too much about them? And then like
I work with Jodah.
But I mean, like, you can have that. That's a very real thing. Like, we're like, oh God, I know so much about their personal lives. Like, I don't know why. Like, it's not really. I'm grateful they feel safe sharing with me. But then again, like now I feel strange. I know way too much about their home life. Like to the point you can't get things done. Like you can't. Like you're like, okay, well, wow. Well, thanks for sharing.
Look at you now in a whole different light, right?
And next time I need help, I think I might call somebody else.
Yeah. You're always every time I come to you, you're crying. Yeah, this is not working for me.
Yeah.
The person who has a perpetual crisis.
There are those. You're right. Those are the people. Yes. And they tend to love to hang around HR and kind of get things done that way, it seems to me sometimes. But
HR loves them. HR loves those people.
They have them on speed dial.
Yeah.
It's even better
Keeps
when
them
they are
employed.
in HR.
Yeah.
Mm.
Oh God, that's scary. So I want to talk about writing. I want to talk about writing and leadership because you've written this book, really great book, like Jodah said. And, I know there's challenges to the writing process, right? So, you've talked a little bit about how you got started, but, I think, Jodah and I have talked about this in previous podcasts that writing about leadership in particular is very difficult.
Yeah.
And so what were your biggest challenges in trying to tackle a subject like leadership and toxic organizations in a narrative book format?
I would say probably like centered around two things. One is, so the role I had before leaving corporate is I led a leadership institute that was responsible for professional development. And so I really was hearing so much from a lot of our corporate leaders that they had a desire to develop, they just didn't have a lot of time for it. So they're working incredibly long hours during the day and they're going home, they've got family, they got kids, like
they got to drink their whiskey.
Oh, yes, they do. And somehow figuring out how to get it all in and read books. And like, don't get me wrong, there's some amazing books out there, but they also require like some really like, you got to sit and think about them and you got to have some quiet because there's a lot of words in there. And so when
words are hard. Words
can be, and depending on how you put them together, it can be really complicated.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that was really important to me is I wanted to write something that felt like a conversation. And I wanted it to feel a little more, so the tone of the book became very intentional. It was very much inspired by my friend, and we were having this conversation is, how do I make this very easy for people to read and have a moment, like, I'm not expecting everybody to read it and walk away with like massive epiphanies, but hopefully they're walking away thinking about like, ooh, could I think about this differently? Can I think about myself differently? And also realize like you're not alone, because sometimes you find yourself in these situations and you're like, oh my God, nobody's ever said that they what do people do when this happens? My favorite is always like when people are talking to leaders and they're like, why do people cry? Like, what do you do when somebody starts crying in your office? And because it freaks them out. Like, because you don't get, there's no training that says, what do you do when somebody starts crying in your office? That's not part of the leadership, leadership handbook that doesn't exist.
Kick them out.
Wait, crying isn't
right?
part of the isn't like step 9 or something like that in the leadership handbook?
You wish. No, it is not. And I feel like we need a leadership handbook. Like, what is it? Because but it was so interesting to me. So how do I make this very approachable, easy to digest, and still walk away with a tangible takeaway? Because the last thing I want to do is have somebody read this and be like, why did I just read this?
You definitely don't get that.
And what exactly was I supposed to get from this? Like, I'm really not sure what this meant, or, so I really wanted to make it very easy for people. The second thing, though, which is kind of more of a humorous thing, is when you're writing scenario-based books and a lot of people know you, and it's people get very centered that they think they know who the characters are based on. And the reality is because I've gotten a lot of that, actually. I've had people call me and say, oh my God, the stuff about so-and-so is brilliant. And I'm like, what stuff? Which stuff are you talking about? Because they're seeing, because of the experience that they've had with different leaders, they're seeing things in the stories that maybe I didn't intend. But boy, they really are seeing it. So you start to see like how other people that have been in my work environments throughout the years are like interpreting it. So that's been fun. I don't want them necessarily to see a specific person or to get distracted by who they think I was writing about. Because it was more of a combination. I kind of took all the trends of the things I was hearing and saying, okay, what are my most common trends? Because the truth is, I have a lot more material than what's in the book.
Oh, do we have another book coming out?
I have to figure out how to use the best of it. I mean, because some of it was just so like outrageous, and I know you like outrageous. So like one of the things that I heard was there was a leader who all the ringtones for women on his phone were different dog barks. So his wife had a dog bark, his assistant had a dog bark, his daughter had a dog bark.
Was that a subconscious or completely conscious decision?
Yeah,
oh no, he thought it was funny. And so like, can you put that in there?
No. He didn't get the connection between the misogynistic thing that he was doing, or was he just?
Well, that's a great question. Again, I didn't talk to the gentleman directly, but this is somebody who worked for him. Right. And so like, oh, let me tell you about this dude. He was something else, like that kind of thing. And so there's a ton of material that isn't in the book because I thought it was so outrageous and so
you should have like you should have like a second book, like a what's it called? Yeah, an outtake. Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
extreme.
That'd be awesome.
But I mean, like, but that being the thing is like, how do I distill it down to something that I felt was most relatable? Because most of those scenarios, people have experienced that, and either they did it themselves, they had it done to them, or they were observers of it. Because that's also we hadn't talked about that, but that's also a component. Is we see a lot of stuff. And what choices do we make as casual observers? Do we race off the bus, or are we trying to like get in there and try to resolve
witness
a problem,
trauma,
and try to help bring some, So some people will never ever do that. They're going to race the other way and say, fight, flight, or flight, fight or flight. I'm off it. I'm out. And then you have some other people though who are just going to lean into it and say, okay, I'm in. How do we fix this? Like, this has got to get resolved. So, I don't know. We'll see what we do with the extra material. But that was my biggest component was how do I write
your
this
current book is your current book is We've All Done It. Maybe this is their next one is but we haven't done this.
I hope not.
The more extreme stories.
Oh my God.
One of my goals, Kimberly, is to write a book about, my perfect leadership style. And so, but I struggle with it because I drink a lot.
Yes.
So at night especially. So what's your advice to writers like me who might have a hard time getting motivated to sit down at the computer and type those hard words in a row? And
couple things. I would say make sure you know who your audience is. So when you say leadership, who exactly are you talking about? I would actually encourage you to envision specific people because it's a lot easier when you think about writing to a person than when you think about writing to an arbitrary group of millions of people called quote unquote leaders. So get very specific in your mind. Who are you talking to? And is your tone of writing appropriate for the person you're actually talking to? Because I think people we get these vague notions of who our audiences are. And so I would try to get very specific. And I would say this, I know people are going to cringe and eye roll, but you have to write on a schedule. Like I wrote every day and I had a block of time and it was protected time. And even if I only wrote 50 words, it was required that I sit down and think about this product, what am I thinking about? What is this chapter about? Just get words down. But I would also say, and I don't know how it works for other people, but I would have moments sometimes, really random moments where washing dishes and stuff, where things would just crystallize very quickly. And I knew exactly what I would want to say. So I would quickly record myself so that I would never miss something. Because if I waited, I would always forget what the idea was. So I would say always have something with you to capture when the inspiration strikes. But also you do really need some discipline if you want to get it done. But that would be the biggest thing is just know who you're writing for and what are you trying to accomplish? What is your goal?
Can I ask another question for Dan? Because what really was asking is, can you be stinking drunk and write a book? That's what he was wondering, though.
Yeah.
Oh my God, that's
how I did
most
my dissertation.
I mean, that may be the best book you could write. I mean, depending, some of our greatest writers, I'm pretty sure, were altered in some way, shape, or form when they were writing things. So,
Fitzgerald, for sure, right?
I mean, yes. So what occasionally,
especially Southern writers.
Yes. I would say alcohol comes in really handy for the editing process.
That way, you're less critical. Yeah. You're sort of a little more just sort of.
You just drink. No, it's you drink. This is shit.
Oh, you definitely hit the wall at some point where you're like, I have made a colossal mistake and have wasted a year of my life. This is awful. And then somebody eventually will talk you off the ledge and be like, oh, stop, Kim, stop it. Bring it in, sister friend, bring it in. But yes.
Well, Harper Lee literally threw the manuscript for To Kill a Mockingbird out of her out of her New York apartment window into the snow at one
God.
point. She was so frustrated.
Oh, okay. So that happens, like just in any writing. And this is like the first book that I've written. So I tell people this, like, I did not have this on the bingo card of life. Like, this was not on some bucket list to do. It was an idea that struck, and then I just kept going with it. And as long as I just kept going with it. And I was like, so there has to be some discipline to it, but also, like, if you're not loving what you're writing, then stop. Like, stop, and then figure out, like, are you, like, has what your initial idea changed or not? Or I would also say this: get an editor and surround yourself with other people. So I had a wonderful community of other writers so that I could ping off of, because I hadn't done this before. So it was nice to talk to other people, and they're like, oh no, where are you in the process? Oh yeah, this happens a lot. Like, you just got to push through. And so having some other writers around you is really helpful. And then you can go drink together and commiserate together.
Is there a website for like meeting other writers, or is that how does that happen?
There's a lot of different avenues. It depends on what you're trying to do, but I mean, Facebook has a lot of them.
Does.
Lots of writers groups.
There's a ton of writers groups.
Lots of people form writers groups.
And what I would try to do is find people who are writing similar stuff to you. Not because they're not going to steal your ideas, but I think they can be complementary to helping you understand, like, the process. And that's what I would encourage you on, is not so much people, I'm kind of contradicting myself, but find people who've written so that you can help you understand the process, because it's a very lonely thing to sit and write a lot of words and then suddenly sharing them with people. And then, that's probably the most vulnerable I think I've ever been in my life, was when I had to share the drafts of it with other people and be like, so does this suck? I mean, that's really the only question. It's like the little kid, does this suck? Question mark. Yes, no, box yes, box no, box maybe. Because that's a hard thing. Writing is a very lonely process, and then getting it out there can be very intimidating. And so that's why I'm very appreciative when I say thank you. I genuinely appreciate it, because this was definitely a little bit of a labor of love, and you're just kind of putting it out in the world, hoping people don't come back and say, wow, you really suck. And I mean, but that's going to happen. I mean, because everybody views it from their own prism. The last thing I'll say, because this is brilliant. So the woman who designed my cover, who is great, by the way, and I'm happy to give her name, is she's Melissa Williams Designs. She's based out of Utah. Phenomenal. She's also a writer. And she told me something that I kept in mind the entire time. And she said, the minute you hit publish, it's no longer your book. It is the book people read, and they're going to look at it through their experience and their prism. It is not your book anymore. So she was like, don't read your reviews. She said, because it's all going to be what stuff you're going to bring up for other people. She also was the funniest person. She said, I thought you wrote because I sent her a copy when we were talking about design. And she said, I thought you were like, this was going to be a self-help book, but you basically wrote a book asking people to admit when they've been assholes. And I was like, yeah, I guess I had.
That's why Jodah likes
it. I guess I did. And she's like, well, it actually is a redemption novel. She's like, it's about redemption though, right? Like, if you do the work, like, you're not really an asshole if you just try to make yourself better. And so she was hysterical. But like, that one piece of feedback from her, I've really held on to, is it is yours until the minute you hit publish. And that it now belongs to each person who reads it, and what they think about it is very different. But that's hard. As I told people, I said, people compare it to childbirth. You hear that a lot. However, there are two people that make a child. There is one person that made this book. So if there is anything that is awkward, weird, strange about the book, it's 100% me. You can't blame it on your significant other, which is what a lot of parents do. Oh, that trait? That's his side or her side.
His genes.
That's somebody else's. That's somebody else's influence. It's not mine. But this is 100% you. So I would just, find your little community. I'm happy to support you in writing. I want to read this book. Quite frankly, I think it'll be phenomenal.
Oh yeah, it's going to be brilliant. It's going to be the greatest.
It'll be the best book ever.
Hey,
it'll be the best book.
Real quick, I want to say Kimberly, that I think of my personal take on your book. Yes, it is a book that highlights when you're being an asshole, but it's a book of reflection. To me, it was one of those mirrors that we were talking about, and it's a great mirror book. You highlight good examples. You give good pauses and questions to provoke people to think about things. So I do highly recommend reading the book. It's fantastic for anybody who wants to see when you're an asshole. But it's definitely a fantastic read and a good read, Tim. Yeah,
thank you.
Excellent book.
Thank you.
Excellent book. So, Kimberly, where can people contact you? Where can they find you if they want to get in touch?
Easiest way is come to my website, KimberlyJBenoit.com, and that is Benoit, as all the Northerners say, Benoit, but that is not right.
It a little French.
Benoit.
And
it's that French influence, right?
Oh, yes, all the way. And then also, you can find me on LinkedIn as well. So you can find me, and those are the two probably easiest places. And, again, anybody who finds themselves stuck in like a toxic place, or they're just like, I really think I'm about to quit, but you're not sure that's exactly what you want to do. Like, you are the person I would love to talk to. Because understanding and like really talking it through sometimes can help people turn situations around. It's possible. Not saying it's going to happen to everybody, but you just never know. So take the time, pump the brakes. Ask for help when you need it.
Thank you, Kimberly. You've been a marvelous guest. We thank you for being on the podcast. We'll have to have you on again sometime. And it seems like an hour and a half has flown by since we've been talking. So thank you.
Thank you. This has definitely been one of the most entertaining conversations I've had in a very long time. So
we
thank
strive.
you.
We strive. I sure hope Disney doesn't come after us. That's okay. We don't know if that's true, Disney. We're just hypothesizing.
Pixar.
Yeah.